In the history of aviation, there have been many incidents that no one had ever imagined before. Often, when an aircraft loses its engines at thousands of feet in the air, its fate depends entirely on the cabin crew's thousands of hours of experience. Something similar happened with this TACA Airlines flight when both of its engines failed at an altitude of 16,000 feet. Interestingly, the pilot in command of the plane, Carlos Dardano, had lost one of his eyes in an accident nearly 3 years before this incident. So, will Captain Dardano be able to bring this plane back to the ground safely today? Or will this day turn out to be the most unfortunate one for the passengers of this flight?
TACA Flight 110.
On May 24, 1988, TACA International Airlines Flight 110 was operating as per its schedule. This Boeing 737-300 aircraft was brand new, leased by the airline just 2 weeks prior. The 737 model was one of the most advanced planes of its time, manufactured by Boeing in the same year. With MSN 23838 as its serial number, it was the 1505th airplane to be produced on Boeing's production line. Aircraft are typically used for 20 to 30 years, and this plane had been manufactured just a few months earlier. So the possibility of any malfunction was extremely low, and flying it was an exciting experience for the pilots. TACA Airlines flight was a scheduled passenger service from San Salvador to Belize City, and then from Belize City to New Orleans, USA. At the time, there were 38 passengers and 7 crew members on board. After completing routine checkups, the flight took off from Philip S. W. Goldson International Airport in Belize City. According to the flight plan, after takeoff, the aircraft was supposed to cross the Gulf of Mexico and then pass over the Louisiana coast, after which it would approach New Orleans International Airport for landing. The 29-year-old pilot in command, Carlos Dardano, had over 13,400 hours of total flying experience, out of which more than 4,000 hours were on this very model of aircraft. In just the last 30 days, Captain Dardano had logged over 85 hours of flying time. About 3 years before this incident, in 1985, an event occurred in Captain Dardano's life that left a lasting impact on his career. In 1985, civil war had broken out in El Salvador, and during that time, Captain Dardano was flying a DC-3 cargo plane in the region. During one of his flights, bullets fired from the ground struck him in the face, injuring him so severely that he permanently lost sight in his left eye. Yet, despite this painful and life-altering incident, Dardano continued his flying career, something that speaks volumes about his extraordinary skill and deep commitment to aviation. In the initial few minutes after takeoff, everything appeared normal, and the aircraft was cruising at 35,000 feet, roughly 10,500 meters, above the Gulf of Mexico. The weather displayed on the pilot's screen looked concerning, but despite that, they began their descent toward New Orleans Airport. This region was experiencing bad weather, clearly visible on the cockpit weather display. Several red cells were showing up on the cabin crew's radar. To fully understand the pilot's decision-making, it's important to understand how weather radar patterns work. Typically, the radar displays weather conditions in 3 different colors. Green indicates clear weather, yellow suggests light rain and mild turbulence, and red means extremely bad weather. At this moment, Flight 110's screen was showing several red areas. Normally, when pilots fly through areas of heavy rain, they keep the engine ignition continuously on so that the engines keep supplying consistent power. Along with that, airplanes are equipped with an anti-ice system, which prevents ice from forming inside the engines. After beginning its descent toward New Orleans International Airport, the aircraft reached an altitude of 30,000 feet when the pilots saw thick cloud cover ahead. To safely pass through these clouds, the pilots activated continuous ignition for the engines and switched on the aircraft's anti-ice system. Despite all the efforts of the cabin crew, the aircraft had now entered a zone filled with thunderstorms, heavy rain, and large chunks of ice. Flying through such a zone is nothing short of a nightmare for any pilot, one they hope will pass as quickly as possible. But in this case, it wasn't a nightmare. It was a harsh reality. At this moment, the pilots were flying through an area where they couldn't see anything out of the cockpit window. They desperately wanted this terrifying journey through darkness to end soon, but they had no idea that the real challenge was yet to come. As the plane descended toward New Orleans International Airport, flying through dense clouds, heavy rain, and large ice particles, it reached an altitude of 16,500 feet, or about 4,950 meters, when the pilots noticed something alarming on their display. The power of both engines was dropping rapidly. At first, the pilots thought it was due to the severe weather conditions, but their misunderstanding was quickly cleared up when both of the plane's engines completely shut down, and the aircraft began losing altitude at a dramatic rate. Both of the CFM56 turbofan engines had failed, and the plane had now turned into a glider, falling through the sky with no thrust and no electrical power. Even after engine failure at thousands of feet in the air, with the aircraft moving at hundreds of kilometers per hour, the fans on the wings continue to spin due to the strong external airflow. Planes are equipped with an auxiliary power unit, which is connected to these spinning fans. In such situations, if the fans keep rotating after the engines shut down, the APU can generate sufficient electrical power for the aircraft. After the engines failed, the crew of Flight 110 activated the auxiliary power unit, which restored electrical power to the plane. If the spinning fans are used to attempt a restart, there's a chance that the engines can come back to life. At 16,500 feet, when both of Flight 110's engines had stopped working, the crew tried to restart them using this exact method. Thanks to the crew's efforts, the engines did restart, but they still weren't producing sufficient thrust. Hoping the engines would regain full functionality, the crew kept the throttle at full power. But instead of generating thrust, the engine temperatures began rising rapidly. This temperature spike posed a serious risk, because if it continued, both engines could catch fire. To avoid a catastrophic situation, the pilots ultimately decided to shut both engines down again. By now, the aircraft had descended to about 10,500 feet, or approximately 3,150 meters, and the pilots' heart rates were climbing with every passing second. It had become clear that the plane would not be able to make it to the runway at New Orleans International Airport. The pilots now had only one option: to locate a safe area nearby and attempt a hard landing. Before beginning the emergency landing procedure, the first officer sent a mayday call to New Orleans Air Traffic Control. The pilots asked ATC for information on any alternate landing sites near the airport. In response, ATC provided details of an alternative landing location, but the pilots knew that at the rate their aircraft was descending, it wouldn't be possible to reach that site in time. In the meantime, the cabin crew began following the standard operating procedures for a water landing. The plane's altitude was dropping rapidly, and within minutes, it had descended below the clouds. Now, at a lower altitude, the pilots could see the ground clearly through the cockpit windows. One of the pilots spotted a large, straight canal below. For a water landing to be even remotely successful, there needs to be a long, straight stretch of water ahead. This canal met all the requirements for a hard ditching. So Captain Dardano began aligning the aircraft for a landing in the canal. This was one of the most intense and terrifying moments for the cabin crew and all the passengers on board. The pilots still had no idea whether the canal actually had enough water to cushion a landing. But with no other option left, Captain Dardano continued to follow every procedure for a hard landing with complete focus. And then, something happened that could only be described as a miracle for this flight. While following the emergency landing procedures, the co-pilot caught sight of something outside the window, large patches of grass. At first, the co-pilot didn't understand what he was seeing, but within a few seconds, the situation became crystal clear. What the co-pilot saw wasn't just grass, it was a levee. In simple terms, a levee is a large, narrow strip of raised ground, usually covered in grass, built alongside canals to prevent overflow into nearby areas. This levee was located near a NASA assembly facility, and upon seeing it, the co-pilot realized that landing on grass might be safer than attempting a water landing. After spotting the levee, the co-pilot suggested to Captain Dardano that they attempt a landing on the grass instead. At first, the suggestion seemed unusual to Captain Dardano, but in a moment of crisis, even a sliver of hope was worth pursuing. Now, Captain Dardano had to make a crucial decision: ditch the plane in the water or attempt a hard landing on the levee. He knew that this decision could determine the fate of 38 passengers and 7 crew members. After a few tense seconds, he accepted the co-pilot's suggestion. He adjusted the aircraft's course slightly and began aligning it with the long, grassy field ahead. Each passing moment now became one of the most critical in the lives of everyone on board. Any loss of control at this point could cause the aircraft to veer off into the water on either side, potentially erupting into flames. But the remarkable experience and seamless cooperation between the captain and co-pilot helped prevent such a tragedy. What made this challenge even greater was the fact that Captain Dardano was flying with just one eye. Humans have 2 eyes primarily to estimate distance and depth accurately. But Dardano didn't have that luxury. He had lost his left eye years ago, and now had to rely entirely on his remaining one. Just before the grassy field began, there was a concrete wall. Captain Dardano had to ensure that the aircraft cleared the wall before touching down, and that it came to a halt before running out of space. Inside the cabin, passengers felt certain that their lives were about to end. Flight attendants were unable to answer any questions, and as the plane rapidly descended, the panic among passengers intensified. Yet, amid all this chaos, Captain Dardano and his crew were doing everything possible to ensure a safe landing on that grassy field. In this nerve-wracking moment, the aircraft cleared the concrete wall. And then, at over 100 kilometers per hour, the rear wheels touched down. A sudden jolt shook the cabin. Everyone was thrown slightly from their seats, and in that flash, passengers saw their entire lives play out like a movie reel. But hope still lingered as the captain and his crew continued their desperate efforts to stop the aircraft. Since both engines had failed, reverse thrust was not an option for slowing down. So immediately after touchdown, the pilots deployed the spoilers and gradually applied the mechanical brakes. Seconds later, these efforts paid off. The aircraft finally came to a halt, just in time. For the pilots, it was nothing short of pulling themselves, their passengers, and the aircraft back from the jaws of death. And within minutes, Coast Guard teams arrived at the scene and safely rescued all passengers. Later, the National Transportation Safety Board launched a detailed investigation into the incident. NTSB's report stated that although the engines were certified by U.S. authorities for flight through heavy weather, they were unable to withstand the dense clouds, heavy rain, and chunks of ice encountered over the Gulf of Mexico on May 24, 1988. The cause of the engine failure was excessive water ingestion. When the aircraft entered the storm, the weather was so extreme that an overwhelming amount of water entered both engines. Despite the pilots keeping the engine ignition on throughout, it wasn't enough to keep them running, and both engines failed. Every incident in aviation teaches us something new. After Flight 110's ordeal, an additional sensor was installed in CFM56 engines to keep them running even when large amounts of water enter. The engine's nose cones and fan blades were also modified to prevent shutdowns in severe weather. Engineers later arrived at the landing site, replaced the failed engines, and after months of repair work, the aircraft flew again, continuing to serve in various airlines for many years to come. This concludes today's video.